Picture this. It's 3000 BCE in the ancient city of and a grain merchant faces an impossible problem. He needs copper tools for his farm, but the toolmaker doesn't want grain. The toolmaker needs cloth, but the weaver won't trade cloth for copper. The weaver wants fish, but the fisherman only accepts pottery. And round it goes. For thousands of years, humanity was trapped in this exhausting dance of barter, where every transaction required finding someone who had exactly what you wanted and wanted exactly what you had. But then something changed. A soft, white metal emerged from the ground that would solve this ancient puzzle and dominate commerce for the next 5 millennia. The question is, why silver? And why did it work for 5,000 years when every paper currency since has eventually failed? Chapter 1. The Problem. The Impossible Dance of Barter. Before we understand why silver became money, you need to feel the chaos that existed without it. Economists call it the double coincidence of wants problem, but that academic phrase doesn't capture the daily frustration of ancient life. In Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE, if you were a farmer with surplus barley, you couldn't just go buy what you needed. You had to find someone who both wanted barley and had what you needed. That alone could take days of searching through marketplace crowds, negotiating chains of multi-party trades that would make modern cryptocurrency transactions look simple. Archaeological evidence from early Sumerian settlements shows traders maintaining complex mental inventories of who needed what. Temple records describe transactions requiring 4 or 5 intermediary trades before both parties got what they wanted. Imagine trying to buy a cart and spending 3 days arranging a sequence where your barley became pottery, the pottery became wool, the wool became copper, and finally the copper became your cart. But the timing problem was even worse. Barley harvests came seasonally. If you needed something in winter but would only have surplus barley in summer, you had no way to bridge that gap. Livestock could die. Pottery could break. Cloth could rot. How do you store value across seasons when everything you own is perishable? This wasn't just inconvenient, it throttled economic growth. Specialization was nearly impossible. Why would you spend years mastering a single craft when you'd waste half your time arranging barter trades instead of actually working? Cities remained small because commerce beyond your immediate neighbors became impossibly complex. Different civilizations tried different solutions. In Mesopotamia, barley itself served as a medium of exchange for smaller transactions. Temple authorities in Uruk maintained granaries and issued clay tokens representing stored grain. But grain has obvious problems as money. Rats eat it. It rots in humidity. A sack of barley in spring isn't the same as a sack in fall. You can't easily divide it for small purchases, and you definitely can't carry enough for major transactions. Some regions tried copper. Archaeological sites throughout Anatolia show standardized copper ingots from around 3500 BCE, clearly used for trade. But copper had the opposite problem of grain. There was too much of it. Copper deposits were common enough that copper's value remained low and unstable. Imagine trying to buy a house and showing up with a wagon piled high with hundreds of copper bars. The ancient world needed something else. Something that was durable but not perishable, rare enough to hold value but common enough to actually circulate, divisible for small trades but concentrated enough for large ones, easy to verify as genuine but hard to fake. What they needed was silver.
Chapter 2. The Rise of Silver. Why this metal won. Silver's emergence as money wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of silver possessing a unique combination of properties that perfectly solved the barter problem. By 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian city-states had standardized the silver shekel. temple records from Uruk show sophisticated accounting systems where debts, wages, and prices were denominated in silver shekels. 1 shekel weighed approximately 8.33 grams, and the purchasing power was substantial. A shekel could buy roughly 300 liters of barley, enough to feed a family for a month. But why did silver beat every other option? First, silver was rare enough to concentrate value. While copper required wheelbarrows full of metal for significant purchases, a few silver pieces could represent months of labor. Gold was even more concentrated, but that created its own problem. Gold was so rare that the smallest divisible units were still too valuable for everyday transactions. Silver sat in the perfect middle ground, what economists would later call the Goldilocks zone of monetary metals. Second, silver was virtually indestructible. Unlike grain or livestock, silver didn't rot, die, or spoil. A piece of silver buried in 3000 BCE could be dug up today and remain perfectly usable. This permanence meant silver could store value not just across seasons, but across generations. Third, silver was universally desired. Mining operations from ancient Anatolia to the Iberian Peninsula produced relatively limited quantities, making silver naturally scarce. Every civilization that encountered it recognized its value immediately. This wasn't arbitrary cultural preference. Silver's physical properties made it inherently useful for jewelry, religious objects, and decorative arts. Even before it was money, people wanted silver. Fourth, silver was easy to verify, but hard to counterfeit. Experienced merchants could test silver's purity through simple techniques like checking its weight, examining its color, and listening to its ring when struck. Silver's relatively low melting point meant it could be refined and formed into standardized shapes. Temple authorities established official weights and often marked authenticated silver with identifying stamps. Archaeological evidence shows silver spread across the ancient world was remarkably swift once it started. Assyrian merchant records from Kanesh, dated to 1900 BCE, detail extensive silver-based trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. These weren't primitive economies. The old Assyrian trading colonies maintained sophisticated financial instruments, including debt contracts, letters of credit, and even early forms of banking, all denominated in silver. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. In Egypt, during the same period, silver was actually more valuable than gold. Temple inventories from around 2500 BCE list silver-to-gold exchange ratios of 1:2 or even 1:1. The reason? Egypt had abundant gold deposits in Nubia but had to import silver from distant sources. The Egyptians called silver white gold, treating it as an exotic luxury. This regional variation in silver-gold ratios created one of history's first international arbitrage opportunities. Merchants who understood that silver was cheap in Mesopotamia but expensive in Egypt could profit from the geographic spread. Archaeological evidence of Mesopotamian silver found in Egyptian tombs and Egyptian gold in Babylonian temples suggests exactly this kind of cross-border trade was happening. The true genius of silver as money was this: it didn't require government mandate to work. Silver became money organically, through market forces, because it was the best solution to the double coincidence of wants problem that had plagued humanity for millennia. Chapter 3. The Expansion, when silver conquered the world. By 600 BCE, silver had evolved from Mesopotamian weights into something revolutionary: actual coins. The transformation happened in Lydia, a kingdom in western Anatolia. King Alyattes and later his son Croesus minted the first standardized coins from electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. But it was the Greek city-states that perfected silver coinage. Around 550 BCE, Athens began minting the famous owl drachma, a silver coin that would become the ancient world's first truly international currency. The Athenian owl coins weren't just metal tokens. Each one bore the image of Athena on one side and her sacred owl on the reverse, with the letters ATHE identifying the issuing authority. More importantly, they maintained remarkably consistent weight and purity. Archaeological analysis of thousands of surviving owl coins shows they contained approximately 4.3 grams of 98% pure silver with astonishing uniformity. Why did this matter? For the first time in human history, you didn't need to weigh and test metal for every transaction. The stamp of Athens guaranteed the coin's value. A merchant in Syracuse could accept an Athenian owl knowing it would be accepted in Tyre or Alexandria without question. This standardization exploded the range of possible commerce. Traders could now operate across the entire Mediterranean without carrying scales and testing equipment. The Laurian silver mine south of Athens produced massive quantities of silver, funding Athens's golden age. At peak production around 480 BCE, Laurian employed over 20,000 workers, many of them slaves, extracting approximately 20 tons of pure silver annually. This wealth built the Parthenon, funded the Athenian navy, and financed the city's cultural flowering. But it was Rome that built the largest silver monetary system in history. The Roman denarius, introduced in 211 BCE, became the backbone of an empire spanning 3 continents. Early denarii contained approximately 4.5 grams of 95 to 98% pure silver. At its height, the Roman Empire minted tens of millions of denarii annually, creating a unified currency system from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine frontier. Roman soldiers received their stipendium, their salary, in silver denarii. The word soldier itself derives from solidus, a later gold coin, but for centuries the denarius was the standard military payment. A legionnaire in the 1st century CE earned approximately 225 denarii per year, enough to buy 2,700 kilograms of wheat. That silver wage remained relatively stable for generations. The Roman system worked so well that denarii minted in Rome circulated freely in distant provinces. Archaeological hoards discovered in Britain contained denarii from mints in Antioch. Coins from Syrian mints appear in Spain. The silver standard unified the Roman economy in a way no paper currency could because the coins had intrinsic value regardless of whose face appeared on the coins. Trade records from Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic eruption of 79 CE, show shopkeepers maintaining accounts in denarii, lending money at interest, and conducting commerce with the same financial sophistication we'd recognize today. One merchant's ledger records a loan of 1,000 denarii at 12% annual interest. Another shows a wine merchant purchasing amphoras for 30 denarii each and selling them for 45 denarii, a healthy 50% markup. Beyond Rome's borders, silver remained the bridge between civilizations. The Silk Road trade connecting Rome with Han Dynasty China was fundamentally a silver exchange. Chinese merchants prized Roman denarii, often melting them down to create Chinese currency or silver artifacts. Roman records describe how silk, purchased with silver in the East, would sell for 10 times its purchase price in Rome, creating enormous incentives for long-distance trade. Indian Ocean trade routes saw Arabic merchants using standardized silver weights to facilitate commerce between African gold mines, Indian spice markets, and Persian manufacturing centers. The ancient world had created a globalized economy, and silver was its common language. But this universal acceptance created a hidden vulnerability that would eventually bring the system crashing down. Chapter 4: The Turning Point, when silver money began to fail. The crisis began slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the middle of the 1st century CE. The Roman denarius, that pillar of the ancient economy, was about to teach humanity its first major lesson about monetary debasement. In 64 CE, Emperor Nero faced a problem that rulers throughout history would find familiar. He'd spent more than the treasury held. The Great Fire of Rome required massive reconstruction spending. Military campaigns along the frontiers drained resources. Nero's lavish building projects, including his famous Golden House, consumed vast sums. The solution seemed obvious: reduce the silver content of the denarius. Nero's mint masters began mixing copper into the silver, reducing the precious metal content from 95% to 93.5%. The coins still looked silver, they still bore the emperor's image and the mark of Rome, but each one contained less actual silver. It was subtle enough that most people didn't notice immediately. That was just the beginning. Each successive emperor faced similar pressures, and each one reduced the silver content a bit more. By the time of Marcus Aurelius in 170 CE, the denarius was only 75% silver. Under Septimius Severus in 194 CE, it fell to 50%. The decline accelerated. By the time Emperor Gallienus took power in 260 CE, the silver denarius contained a mere 5% precious metal. It was essentially a copper coin with a thin silver wash on the surface. You can probably guess what happened to prices. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded that between 200 and 270 CE, prices increased approximately tenfold. A modius of wheat that cost 2 denarii in the early empire required 20 or more denarii by the crisis years. Temple records from Egypt show similar inflation in other commodities. A worker who could buy a month's grain with 2 silver denarii in 100 CE needed 12 degraded denarii to buy the same amount in 250 CE. But here's the critical insight. Romans weren't stupid. They understood what was happening. People began hoarding older coins with higher silver content and spending newer debased coins. This is called Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good. The best silver coins disappeared from circulation, melted down or buried in hoards like those archaeologists keep discovering across the former empire. The Roman economy adapted in ways that should sound familiar. Merchants began demanding payment in gold instead of silver for large transactions. Some regions reverted to barter for local trade. Price controls were attempted and failed spectacularly. Emperor Diocletian's famous Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE tried to freeze prices across the empire, but merely drove commerce underground into black markets. The debasement of the denarius wasn't the only cause of Rome's decline, but it was catastrophic for economic stability. When people can't trust that the money they're paid today will buy the same amount tomorrow, long-term planning becomes impossible. Lending stops, investment halts. The sophisticated financial networks that had united the empire began to fragment. Archaeological evidence shows the results. Roman Britain, once integrated into the empire's silver economy, began producing crude local imitations of coins by the 4th century CE. These barbarous radiates barely resembled denarii, but served as monetary substitutes in an economy starving for trustworthy currency. Trade volumes contracted, cities shrank. The complex specialization that silver money had enabled began to unravel. The lesson was clear, even if it took centuries for historians to fully articulate it. When you debase the currency, you debase the economy itself. But Rome's collapse didn't end silver's monetary role. Throughout the medieval period, European economies operated on silver and gold standards. Spanish silver from the New World would flood Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, financing empires and inflating prices across continents. Silver dollars would become the basis of American currency. Even the word dollar itself derives from thaler, a silver coin minted in the Kingdom of Bohemia. For 5,000 years, from those first Mesopotamian shekels to the mid-20th century, silver remained a cornerstone of the monetary system. Governments rose and fell, empires collapsed, technologies transformed civilization, but through it all, silver maintained its role as money. Until 1971. Chapter 5. The Modern Experiment. 50 years versus 5,000. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made an announcement that ended 5,000 years of history. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold or silver at any fixed rate. The last link between modern currency and precious metals was severed. For the first time in human civilization, the world's dominant currency would be backed by nothing but government promise. Nixon called it temporary. 50 years later, we're still in this temporary arrangement. The contrast is stark. Silver served as money for 5 millennia across dozens of civilizations, through countless wars, empires, and technological revolutions. Our current system of pure fiat currency has existed for just 50 years, primarily in times of relative peace and unprecedented prosperity. Which one is the experiment? The modern economy operates on a scale that would be impossible with physical silver. Global GDP exceeds $100 trillion. Annual silver production is approximately 26,000 metric tons, worth roughly $23 billion at current prices. There simply isn't enough silver to back modern money supply without either massively restricting the money supply or seeing silver prices increase to levels that would paralyze the existing system. But the purchasing power comparison is instructive. Since 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost approximately 86% of its purchasing power due to inflation. What cost $1 in 1971 costs about $7 today. Meanwhile, silver's purchasing power, while volatile, has broadly maintained its value relative to basic commodities like grain and energy. The pattern Rome experienced is visible in modern data. When Emperor Nero began debasing the denarius in 64 CE, it took roughly 2 centuries for the currency to lose 95% of its silver content. The US dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power in just over a century since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913. The time frames are different, but the direction is eerily similar. Modern central banks argue they've learned from history. Unlike Rome's crude debasement, today's monetary policy is sophisticated, data-driven, and carefully managed. Inflation targeting, reserve requirements, and regulatory frameworks are meant to prevent the mistakes of the past. The counter-argument is that Rome's emperors also believed they were being sophisticated and careful, right up until the system collapsed. What's certain is that modern governments have the same incentives that drove Roman emperors to debase their currency. Spending pressures exceed revenues. Wars must be financed. Economic crises require intervention. The temptation to create new money is powerful, and unlike physical silver, digital currency can be created at the stroke of a keyboard. The archaeological record from ancient Rome shows us what happens at the end of this road. By the 4th century CE, people had lost faith in official currency and returned to trading by weight in gold and silver, treating coins simply as metallic commodities rather than government-backed money. The sophisticated monetary system that had unified an empire had been destroyed by the very authority that created it. We're told that can happen now, that modern institutions are stronger, that technology has changed the equation. Perhaps that's true, but 5,000 years of silver as money represents a remarkably long track record. 50 years of purely fiat currency is, in historical terms, barely a pilot program.
From that Mesopotamian merchant in 3000 BCE trying to navigate the chaos of barter, to the peak of Roman commerce unified by silver denarii, to our modern world of digital transactions and central bank balance sheets, the story of silver as money reveals something fundamental about human civilization. Money isn't just a convenient tool for trade. It's a store of information, a carrier of trust across time and space. Silver worked for 5 millennia because it was nobody's liability. A silver coin didn't depend on the credibility of any government or the stability of any empire. It had value because it was silver, period. Every paper currency in history has eventually failed, every single one. The Roman denarius, Chinese flying money, French assignats, Weimar Reichsmarks. The list goes on. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is around 27 years. Our current system is 50 years old and counting. The question isn't whether silver will become money again in the way it was for 5,000 years. The global economy is too large, too complex, too dependent on flexible money supply for a return to pure metallic standards. But the question that should keep us awake at night is this: if civilizations far simpler than ours couldn't maintain the integrity of their currency over the long term, what makes us think we can? That Mesopotamian merchant who started our story solved the double coincidence of wants problem with silver. The problem we face today is different, but equally fundamental: the double coincidence of trust. We need money that both facilitates modern commerce and maintains value across time. So far, we haven't found that balance. The silver shekel lasted longer than any empire. Will the dollar?